Good morning, everyone, or depending on where you're located, good afternoon or good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode number 10 of the My Food webinar series. My Food is funded by the partnership grant awarded in 2021 by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And the goal of the My Food project is to design and implement a new and innovative high-impact global research and knowledge mobilization agenda focused on the neglected interactions between migration and food security. Today, we'll be exploring a topic that speaks directly to these interactions, the issue of food insecurity amongst Indian international students in the Greater Toronto Area, and specifically the research that Dr. Sutama Ghosh has conducted in this regard, someone who I'm excited to introduce you to in a moment. My name is Jeremy Wagner, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. I'm a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, studying urban food insecurity myself. So I'm particularly excited to be in conversation with all of you today. I encourage everyone to participate today by posing questions and comments in the chat that I will happily read out once the presentation has concluded. Before I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not engage in conflict. From the Haldimand Proclamation of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending to the proportion to the head of said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution, despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada. Those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. As we begin today's discussion, I encourage everyone joining us, either live or watching afterwards, once posted to YouTube, to reflect deeply about the land upon which you reside and the ways in which you practice reconciliation in your daily life. At this point, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sutama Ghosh as our speaker here today. Dr. Ghosh is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University. After completing her PhD at York University, Dr. Ghosh taught in the Department of Urban Studies at York University and the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto's Scarborough campus. Her major research focus is on the migration and settlement geographies of immigrants and refugees to Canada. Dr. Ghosh, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. And I must say, the topic of international student food insecurity is one that I've been focused on in my work here at Wilfrid Laurier University. So I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation with you today. And please go ahead, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Just a little bit of a background about myself. I was an international student to Canada. I came here in 1999. And from that time onward, I have been, thinking about the type of food that was, at that time available on campus. I was at York University. And then how over time, as I progressed in my PhD, how acquiring or even consuming food on campus became more and more difficult for me as an international student. And following that, when I started working at these various organizations, like every other PhD student does, at limited term faculty positions, and then following that, even at Ryerson University, which is now known as TMU, the on-campus availability of food and the prices were just simply soaring. And I started a conversation about that with my grad students in the Immigration and Settlements master's program. And that is when I first started about thinking about international students and their access to food. So thank you so much for actually allowing me to present this research paper, and I hope to go in for some collaborations in the future, because definitely this is a topic that is not only close to my heart, but also something that I have experienced in my lifetime. So okay, so having said that, it is about, the topic is from rite of passage to major concern: multiple food vulnerabilities of Indian international students in the Greater Toronto Area. And in this paper, I'm only talking about the college students whom I have studied recently. So, because most of you already know, but some of you, there could be other people who are sort of an international audience. In Canada, food insecurity, even though this is a First Nation, a first world country, food insecurity is measured by different organizations in different ways. But if we just stick to what Statistics Canada does, it has been, Statistics Canada has kind of become a little more concerned about food insecurity since 2005. And so they do collect data through their community health services, and then household food security service sort of surveys. And what they have found in 2021 is that about 16% of Canadian households are food insecure, which in terms of numbers is 5.8 million, of which 1.4 are children. And therefore, it is a major, of course, a major concern. Statistics Canada basically defines food insecurity to be on like three different levels. The first being marginal food insecure, where people are worrying that they have limited supply or limited access to food because they don't have money. The second being moderate, where people are deliberately compromising in the quality or quantity of food because, again, money is a major factor. And the third one, where people are actually missing meals, reducing their food intake, or even going without food. So that is the severity of food insecurity. And this has been very well studied by scholars, particularly at the University of Toronto. Valerie Tarasuk is one of the pioneers who studied the food insecurity aspect. And if you look at, and some of these recent studies have shown that um, in terms of household food insecurity, again, it is important to actually say that food insecurity is measured at the household level. And there could be some problems with that, and we'll discuss that later. It seems that in Canada, though, the severity of food insecurity is actually only 4.2%. In terms of provinces, Ontario has about 16.1% people who are, in fact, food insecure. So if we go into a little bit deeper on what has been identified by these scholars, and who has been identified by these scholars as being food insecure, well, Indigenous populations and visible minorities, recent immigrants, households with children under the age of 18, female lone parents, people who are in fact working. There are, of course, also seniors who are on public pensions, and then people on social assistance. Those who rent are also very vulnerable and can be food insecure. But at the end of the day, the geography of the city or the location actually matters. Even though food insecurity has been less studied when it comes to university students, but as you can see, there has been some amount of work in this area, particularly starting around with silver thorns, I think, the study, and then actually gaining momentum, particularly in 2018 onward. But most of these studies are on university students students in general. A little bit has been done, very little has been done on college students and on international students. As far as I know, in Canada, there has not been any systematic study. So usually the effects of food insecurity, I think that becomes that once we realize what the outcomes of food insecurity is, I think one becomes much more cautious about the situation and becomes more concerned about the fact. So it has been long established that student food insecurity is associated with lower GPAs and higher mental health and substance abuse. And this work is primarily coming from the United States rather than coming from Canada. Recent studies have, in the United States, for instance, have reported that prior to the pandemic, student food insecurity, particularly for university students, was between 32 to 43%. In Canada, though, again, as I said, Silverthorne's work from 2016 onward has shown that our university students in particular have very high, actually kind of uh, consistently high levels of food insecurity since that time, which is about comes to about 40%. Yet to a large extent, student food insecurity has been considered as a rite of passage and not a major concern, and particularly in relation to international students. And this is what I'm here to talk about today. So a little bit of background on international student migration and international students to Canada. Currently, as we all know, the level of the number of international students is about 800,000. Canada went from a benevolent state of benevolence to neoliberalism, where academic capitalism is used not only to attract international students, but it is a major strategy that is adopted at the federal level from 2014 and 2019, so that international students are an important source of labor supply for this country. The federal government sets the targets of international students, but it comes down to the provinces to designate these learning institutions, and of course the cities then actually get the international students, and it is definitely connected. Also, it may be connected to the whole concept of regionalizing immigrants, when we particularly see how international students are also not only coming to the GTA, but also to the smaller cities, and we can discuss that at another time. You can see that the enrollments have increased over the years, and particularly in relation to even in the pandemic, there's been a slight decrease, but overall it has been on the rise. Enrollments of students, however, if you look at university versus colleges, even though in general, overall in Canada, there are more university students who are coming from internationally. But if you look at Ontario, the proportion of college students is very high. We know very little about the experiences of international students in colleges. And one of the main problems, particularly when it comes to university versus colleges, is that we don't realize that even though most universities in Canada are funded, most community colleges are also funded by the province. Private colleges are not. These are all operated sometimes by immigrants themselves. And this has been in the recent news quite a bit. So the fundamental differences between universities and colleges pertains to, of course, tuition fees, which in the university at the moment is about 36,000, according to Statistics Canada, per year. The admission requirements are different. Work regulations had been different, but now, of course, things are changing. But if you look at the cost of studying at a university with living expenses, again, that is also very geographical and differs from city to city. In the GTA, this is actually quite high. And then when you compare how it is with colleges, I just want to quickly state that there are different types of colleges that are here in Ontario. There are community colleges which are funded by the province, and there are 5 of those community colleges in Ontario. But if you look at the number of private colleges, there are over 400, actually close to 450, and you can actually classify them into large, medium, and small. And the tuition fees are quite variable in these colleges, as are admission requirements, work regulations, and the value that you get from these colleges. The fact of the matter is that the students who are going to these colleges, because the college situation is that varied, therefore their food insecurities are also quite varied, and in comparison to university students, as well as between these colleges. And we can discuss again these issues further. Indian students, some of these are actually kind of approximations, because how many students are actually in the private colleges, we don't know. But by and large, as you can see, compared to UK and USA, Canada, which is shown in the light blue, there is a huge number of international students coming abroad to study. And in terms of their estimates, Indian students have nearly quadrupled in over the past 5 years. Here is a picture of University of Toronto actually directly marketing to get international students from India. Even though I have some research done on this recruitment strategies. We can discuss if anybody's interested. The number of Indian students, most of these people are coming to the GTA, and a lot of them, of course, are going to the colleges. So overall, what do we know about international student migration and settlement experiences in Canada, and where do Indian students fit in this? First of all, we do know that international students face multifaceted challenges: academic, housing, employment, pathways to permanent residency, lack of institutional support. And these are well established. But most of this literature has concentrated on Chinese students, graduate students, and not so much on the other, nationalities, particularly Indian students. But there has been some work on Koreans and Indian students more recently. Food insecurity has not been studied in as much depth. And again, comparative research is, of course, is lacking. So when I started the study, I must admit, I did not think of actually the food insecurities, and that was not the main, focus of the study when I began studying the challenges and resiliences of Indian international students in GTA colleges. But after the first or 1 or 2 pilot interviews, it was quite evident that the availability of food or accessibility to food was coming up in the conversation, and actually, when we were doing these casual conversations about employment in particular and housing in particular, these issues came up. And then, of course, in discussion with my wonderful colleagues and research assistants, we then added food insecurity as an important aspect of this study. And I am not a food scholar, so I seek your forgiveness if I present anything that is not, up to standard. So when we realize that food insecurity is something that we should actually ask about, ask the students to talk about, we wanted to know how severe was their food insecurity going by the Stats Canada's measures, what were their causes, and how was it related to housing, employment, etc. So in other words, we wanted to see how housing, employment, sense of belonging, etc. Affected their food insecurity, and then how food insecurity affected these aspects, and what were their coping strategies. We did 30 interviews, and we can talk about this. I think I should go directly into what we found. And of course, one of the main things we did was the campus surveys, and that actually opened our eyes a lot on this issue of food insecurity. So when it came to availability, we went to all 5 community colleges. I personally went to all these community colleges, went into their cafeterias, took pictures. When it came to private colleges, we also did the same. Of course, private colleges do not have such wonderful campuses. So it depended on where the private college is. And often people had to walk quite a distance to get to the food space. So let's look at what does the literature tell us and what did we find. One of the things we found, one of the things that the literature told us is that international students are often, and again, these are done on Chinese graduate students, that there was a problem of acculturation. But what we found that in our group is that they were very much aware of what Western food is, and they did not see any difference between a samosa and a burger. Both were high sugar, high fat laden fast foods. And in fact, some of the students were very happy that they were in food heaven, because on campus, and these are all community college people, is that they found a lot of American fast food. So availability of culturally acceptable food on campus was not an issue at all. However, as I have just mentioned, that compared to the college campuses located in auto-dependent outer suburbs of the GTA, people who went to the downtown colleges had more food options, albeit the food was more expensive on campus. Meal plans were another big issue, because sometimes the meal plan did not work for them. Even though they had to purchase the meal plan, the food, the money was spent very quickly if they spent it on campus. So sometimes the money that is in the meal plan was not used as well. In terms of accessibility, this is where I think most of the research has been undertaken, whether it's on immigrant food insecurity or on student food insecurity. And it's always about, okay, it's about income. It is the lack of income that makes food inaccessible. What we found is that it is not just income, but how how people actually have migrated, and what are their familial responsibilities, that actually played a very important role. So in this case, Sagar, who came from Punjab to a community college, said that after paying tuition and transportation phone costs, I have very little left, which I send home so that my dad can repay the loans he took for me. And I can, it's important to realize that not international students who are coming here are not rich. And in many cases, this is a household sort of a strategy to send the elder male member over to Canada. The another important issue that is related to accessibility is that even though these students had kitchens in their apartment which they shared, nobody had any time to cook. The reason why they did not have any time to cook, and this is among both community and private college students, is that they were working multiple jobs in addition to being a full-time student. How did they manage all that is something of a miracle, actually. In terms of utilization of food, racism, discrimination played a very important role. And this came to not only when students were actually sharing spaces, but also when they went and sought housing from private landlords. As these codes clearly demonstrate when they are staying with people of other ethno-religious groups, there were issues. So first of all, when they went to seek housing, of course, they were discriminated, which we will come to in a minute. But even when they were seeking house from another Desi landlord, if the person was not from the same religious background, they were forbidden to cook, for example, beef, or in other context, pork, and therefore they had to basically consuming culturally acceptable food was a difficulty, even in their homes, for which they paid so much money. Some of the coping strategies was to basically, simply not live where they should be living. So the locational compromises. So, students who were actually attending, say, for example, George Brown, they had to live all the way in Brampton or Mississauga and or Scarborough, and basically commute. Because as Sakkaran said, as soon as the landlords figured out that they were from India, they would say, "Oh, will you cook curry?" Then they will not give you the place. And in some cases, as a result of such discrimination, not finding affordable housing, a place to live in downtown, they were forced to live with other Desis. And then again, within that, there were other religious and other issues, dietary issues. Many of the students that we found, they took up employment in a grocery store or a restaurant, because if they did so, they would get groceries a little bit cheaper. And in a restaurant, they got to eat a little bit cheaper, or sometimes even one free meal. But this employment that they had to take up in order to cope with their, food vulnerabilities, was not actually translating into a job experience, because this is not in their area of expertise. A lot of them also relied on ethnic community, particularly tiffin services. And my later on, the research that I did after during COVID-19 showed that during COVID-19, this reliance on tiffin services absolutely did not work, because they had no, suddenly when the lockdown happened, all these tiffin services almost stopped immediately. And many students, suffered because they had absolutely no access to food at all. And some of us did some kind of, arranged, organized some stuff for people. Um, so what did we learn? Food insecurity among international students in the GTA is multidimensional and multi-scalar challenges. There are, at the macro level, there are international tuition fees, which are so high, and therefore people have to have multiple jobs. In the housing situation, depending on how you slice this at the meso level, people, international students of Indian international students of various religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, had different challenges. And of course, socioeconomic circumstances also played a very important role at the micro level. Unfamiliarity with mainstream food and limited knowledge of the location of culturally appropriate food was not at all important for our study group. Availability of food off campus was also an insignificant issue. It was more about, how they are managing their time, particularly with having to, earn, as well as then going and attending classes and then prepare meals. People did not have any of that. There was a total lack of support that I found, particularly from the community and the private colleges. No meal exchange programs or student-led strategies were found in these colleges. With regards to some of the coping strategies I've already mentioned, and people, as we have seen, that despite those coping strategies, most of the students were either moderately or severely food insecure. One of the things that we found, and this is where I'm going to end my conversation, is that when we first started asking them, okay, what did you eat for breakfast? What did you eat for lunch and dinner? This is through that conversation, actually, most of the students became aware of their food insecurity. They sort of were going in the flow, they didn't even think about it. So this person said, since I have been speaking to you, I just realized that actually nothing is all right. I'm not working enough. I do not have enough time to study. I'm not sleeping. I'm not eating properly. But I need to work to go to school. If I don't go to school, I will lose my status. And if I don't go to work, I cannot pay my rent or fees. So you can see how it is a sort of a circular problem. So if you use a justice and equity approach, we can see that action research shows that very little attention has been paid to this very important form of urban inequity. Student voices, were, as I said, they were actually not aware. There is a lack of student-led strategies, particularly at the college level. We did find some strategies are adopted at the university level, and more research is necessary. I think I am going to stop here. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, for that great presentation. And I really appreciate the quote that you ended the presentation on, noting that a lot of international students don't necessarily know that they're experiencing food insecurity. That's a finding that we also resonates in our community here at Laurier too, and some of the work that we've been doing with students. So at this point, we'll open the conversation up and welcome questions and comments for Dr. Ghosh. So please type your question and comments into the chat function, and I'll happily read them out loud for you. As we wait for those questions to come in, I'll take advantage of this opportunity and ask a couple of questions that I've been patiently sitting on myself here. And so the first one I have for you, Dr. Ghosh, is around, and you touched on this briefly, but the state of research and knowledge on the issue of international student food insecurity, not just in the Greater Toronto area, but all across Canada at post-secondary institutions. You noted that research to date is quite limited, but based on that minimal research that has been conducted in other areas in Canada, how does it compare to your findings? Can you say that from your findings in the GTA, you can generalize those findings across Canada?
Yeah, this is hard to say. I don't think you can generalize. There are certain issues that perhaps one can understand. For example, the lack of student-led movements or student-led strategies, particularly in the colleges, right? I don't think I can generalize because I am unaware of enough studies that has been done on the college students. As I said, the university students receive a lot more support. There are meal exchange programs. Those are, I remember we also had these grad potlucks, etc. Particularly at the grad level, you have those even micro level strategies that have been undertaken. In the United Kingdom, for example, they do have some kind of a strategy to help international students secure food. I am unaware of any such national level strategies that has been undertaken, or even at the institution level. For example, at TMU, because of the urban sustainable food growth that they are doing now on the terraces, they do sell vegetables and honey and all that at a cheaper price. For food has become accessible to. But how many students actually know about that? Particularly international students who are running from pillar to post literally to make ends meet. So I don't know. I I don't even want to generalize, because I don't think that there can be a policy that fits everybody. I think one of the things, to some extent, yes and no. Like, I think at the universities, or at the institutional level, there should be some strategies, or student-led movements. But at the um, level of so I was also reading some of these materials that came out of the United States, particularly their vulnerabilities during COVID-19, or in general. Another thing that struck me is that a lot of these studies are also quantitative in nature. So to what extent have that kind of survey type, design type? So I really don't see that the vulnerabilities, the multiple vulnerabilities aspect is not that well understood. I don't know. Am I right on this?
I think so. Yes. Thank you for that detailed response. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but I have another one for you. And I think, as you rightly noted in I think it was your concluding slide, that international student food insecurity and financial burden generally should be considered an issue of inequity on our campuses and in our cities. The international student experience can be very different than domestic students' experiences, and can come with a unique set of challenges. And one of the pieces that you noted on that I want to pick up is the issue of housing, knowing full well that it does drive food insecurity in a significant way. So when it comes to housing specifically, what disadvantages do international students face when it comes to securing safe, appropriate, and affordable accommodations?
So one of the major issues, sorry, there is a question in the chat. One of the housing is the main important issue, because if you look at particularly in the GTA, right? If I can digress a little bit, I will talk to you about the GTA issue. We all know that housing, it's a major problem, right? It's not just affordability, housing affordability, particularly on campus housing for university students, but colleges do not provide any on campus housing, right? So as a result of that, these people have to rent on market, have to pay the market rent. There's no subsidized housing. So housing, and they compromise on that housing. For example, even I think yesterday I saw an advertisement that for a 1 bedroom in Greater Sudbury, it is $700, 1 bedroom, and shared kitchen and bathroom, etc. So actually, I also did, this is where I'm going to digress a bit, because I did some research on, just finished the work on collecting data on Greater Sudbury international students issues. The food insecurity remains the same, but the causes of food insecurity cannot be all put into one issue, and that is of income, because it is not just about income. It is also about discrimination, particularly against Indian students. And what I don't understand is that if we want people from various other countries, why aren't we educating people that, you have to live up with curry smell? I mean, I don't know what else to say, because I feel that despite all these laws, they're still discriminating against people by saying you're going to cook curry. I mean, is that even acceptable? Right? But if you look at what's happening in Greater Sudbury, which is a much more homogeneous city, right? Compared to Toronto, the amount of immigrants is only 6%, and visible minorities is even less, right? So over there, the issue of food insecurity is actually about availability. Whereas in the GTA, I'm talking about Indian students, the issue is about accessibility and utilization, right? Eating culturally acceptable food. I think, and again, I thanks to Margaret, actually, I was able to go through, and I'm not a food scholar, so this is a new area for me as well. But I was able to go through a lot of studies in the US none of them actually discuss um, sort of the issues, the issue of food insecurity beyond the income part of it. It is all related to income. And I find that is only a very small part of the whole picture, important, but very small part. Yeah, sorry, I gave you a long-winded answer.
No,
Yeah.
that's great, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you. And just seeing that Dr. Crush has a question as well here. Thank you for already touching on Margaret Walton Roberts' question. Dr. Crush asks, have there been any studies of the food security of internal migrant students in India itself? If not, how would their situation likely differ from Indian international students in Canada?
I don't know that answer. Thank you, Professor Crush, for that question. I know that MI Food does a lot of work, and I was looking, that it's more on South-South migration but I have not looked into that at all. However, I can say that, again, this needs to be researched more, but there is definitely a connection why we have so many students from Punjab coming as international students to Canada, and what may food production and the aftermath of Green Revolution and whatever is going on with the farmers' movements in India has got to do with migration. That I know a little bit about, but I haven't. But no, I cannot answer Professor Crush's question actually.
Thank you. And we have a few minutes left, so I encourage everyone in the audience to continue to ask questions and drop them in the chat. While we wait for more, I have another question for you, Dr. Ghosh, and it concerns food support services that are available for international students. And you noted that there are significant differences between colleges and universities in this regard. But there's a growing trend across universities and colleges in Canada to internationalize and recruit, talented prospective students living in India and in other countries. But some would argue that this leaves post-secondary institutions with the responsibility of, at a minimum, providing the support services necessary to ensure their success as a student while studying in Canada. So in terms of best practices or ideal examples, are there any universities or college systems in place that other institutions would be able to learn from and implement themselves?
I think, honestly speaking, I think we could probably, there has to be a movement. There has to be more awareness and putting the onus on, say, for example, why isn't the food that is available on campus subsidized for students? I'm not saying subsidize it for us, even though, honestly speaking, I cannot afford to eat on campus even now as an associate professor. I can't. It is that unaffordable. So think about what is available on campus. Like the picture I showed you before, it's the pizza, it's the Tim Hortons. And I couldn't, because of the paper has more about this actually, which is published in the Canadian Geographer. What are they eating is Tim Hortons and drinking coffee all day, all day. So I think it's not just whether you have these cafeterias which has multiple cuisine. It is what is affordable, what are you doing. And also, if you do a campus survey, most of this is junk food. It's even though there is all this about healthy eating and all that, I think we need to have a strategy in terms of, first of all, forget international students. Food that has to be healthy, that is healthy, should be available on campus, right? And that food cannot be 1,000 times more expensive than Tim Hortons donuts and coffee. And this is common sense. I really don't see it as anything spectacular and new I'm talking about, right? Thirdly, the microwaves, I don't know about your campus, but in my campus, there are two microwave ovens, and and even if you have these microwave ovens, the lineup of the students is huge, who are bringing food from home. The other thing is, look at the tuition costs. I mean, this is, common sense. I mean, why have you made the tuition cost this high that the students are unable? But you want them, right? You want them to work here, pay taxes here, etc. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ghosh. There's another question in the chat from Belinda Dodson. She says, "Hi, Sutama, fascinating presentation. I was struck recently by international students from India and elsewhere providing food for people affected by post-tropical storm Fiona in Atlantic Canada. Did you find similar initiatives in your study, i.e. international students helping non-students, non-Indian people in the local community?"
Oh, wow. This is such a good question. I'll tell you a little bit of a story during COVID-19. As I told you, these things were happening. And I was in touch with some of these international students because we had just finished the study, but I still were in touch with them. And I asked them, what are you eating? What's going on? And they say, well, we don't have anything, we're stuck in the house. So my husband and I, and with a few of our friends, we started this thing that we are going to cook some meals and take it for them. But you know what, they not only ate those, of course they were very happy, but they also shared it with everybody else in there. So that was one thing. But later on, we said, can we give you groceries and you can do that? They did it. A lot of those students, actually, I wish I could write about this. They did such a wonderful job of not only helping themselves but also helping those who were living in the same area. And no, I don't think they were all Indian. I really don't think so. But a majority of them were perhaps Indian or Pakistani, because they were sharing these spaces. Um, Indian international students, I don't want to say it's only the Indian international students doing this. Actually, the Sudbury project also showed that there was a huge amount of cooperation between international students. There's some sort of a, something that binds them together, and they feel for each other. And yeah, we got that a lot, particularly from the Sudbury project, where we asked about the effects of COVID-19 on food insecurity. That definitely, Professor Dodgson, we got a lot of instances where there were such, mutual cooperation and help. Yeah. But not just Indian, all international students, many international students rather. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left, so encourage folks to participate and drop comments, questions in the chat still. In the meantime, I do have another question for you, Dr. Ghosh. You mentioned briefly about how expensive tuition is for international students, and how quite often they're having to not only be full-time students, but work full-time just in order to make ends meet at a bare minimum. I've personally been paying close attention recently to the federal government's budget that was just released a couple of days ago. And I think universities and colleges across Canada have expressed some disappointment about that. And graduate students specifically rely on work opportunities in research and TA-ships, for instance, to support themselves throughout their studies. But the budget for graduate and postdoctoral research funding was left out, despite continued efforts by lobbyists and advocates for significant increases, given that there's been a freeze in that regard for nearly 2 decades now. So how do you think this continued underfunding of graduate researchers impacts international graduate students from an equity perspective?
Oh, I can't begin to talk about this. But
I
if
think
you
we're
look
rolling
at,
our eyes together.
I know, if you think of international, so I, as Margaret, myself, and many of us were international students actually when we came to Canada. And the amount of support we received, I never paid international tuition fees. It was always the domestic fees. And, the amount of support I received from my university, even though I could not apply for the Shark Fellowship because I was Indian at that time. So, but the amount of support I received, I may have had some food insecurity, but it was never the severeness this bad, right? But and that is because my tuition fees were also lower and all that. But the problem that I see now is international students are not even coming to Canada because there's no funding. In our university, we have PhD policy studies program. We have not had a single international student. Okay, I don't know, maybe past 4 or 5 years. I have two students who were formerly international students, but now they are Canadian citizens who are my PhD students. Both of them have to now work full time and actually go into a part-time status because they cannot make ends meet. Talk about, I mean, uh, yeah. And therefore their PhDs are, of course, it is going to be a much slow progress because they have to make ends meet. They have to take up any job they can find. And um, I just don't understand the systemic challenges and how, after so many years of research, we are still there, so much of advocacy, and we are still not progressing as much as we should have, right?
Yeah, I agree. And it was very disappointing to see that that was left out of the recent budget that was released. I don't see any new questions in the chat. So if there are no other comments or questions, I think that concludes today's webinar. So thank you, Dr. Ghosh, so much for this engaging conversation that, quite frankly, post-secondary institutions in Canada and those working at them and around them need to be paying more attention to. I can speak on behalf of everyone in attendance today to say that your work is very insightful and really illuminates some important inequities in our communities that need more attention. So thank you for that. For everyone who joined us, thank you so much for your participation. Look out for upcoming webinars in our My Food webinar series. You can follow us on our website, as well as subscribe to our channel on YouTube, where we post all of our previous webinars, and also follow us on Facebook and Twitter on Moving on Empty. Thanks again for joining, everyone, and until next time.
Thank you.